Hey guys, this would be my take of why I quit games. So take it as you will. This is not prescriptive. This is just my thoughts regarding games. And truly, without beating around the bush, the main reason was that I was kind of addicted. Now, I'm certainly not going to be proposing that games suddenly and sharply got worse over time, and I can't really make this claim in the first place because essentially we just have more games, and you are under no obligation to play the new games. Yet it's also true that more games fall into the category of doesn't respect your time. So, like 25 years ago, again, we're going back quite a bit, basically the strategy was make a good game and sell it, with not much of a focus on how much the players might play the game. Because you don't care, right? You just want to sell the game, and they play it, and that's it. Now, certainly there are more or less replayable games, but more and more over time, games kind of deliberately wasted your time. And not on accident, because you might argue that some games kind of wasted your time on accident, but this was all built into the game, so either the players play more, or they spend more. In fact, we can ask the question that, is the game good? And I would propose the best way to answer this question is after you played it, or much after you played it. Because you might have answers such as, nah, I was bored, or the game pisses me off. And essentially, there's no good way to define what good is. So you might look at One-Arm Bandit and conclude that is the most boring, annoying thing ever. Yet if you're addicted to it, then it's great. So arguably, most games fall into the category of Skinner box / compulsion loops. Because fundamentally, if you think about it, then satisfying and satiating experiences lead to lower playtimes. What was the last time you played a game and you played it like 10 minutes and like, you're so full, man? And then you haven't played it again for like a year, right? Games don't work like that. The only right answer is more time, more money. Now, you can argue that that could be fine, a more time aspect of it. But is it quality time? And you may have had the experience that, sure, you played the game, but in a way it's kind of akin to, like, pulling up your phone and you don't like it that much, but you do it a lot instead of reading a book. But if you read a book, then you would find it a lot more satisfying. In fact, these days, people might just pull up their phone and it's a negative experience, but you're still addicted to it. In fact, the negative aspect has a key role that it can be positive or negative. So now you're addicted. You don't know what you're going to get. It's sometimes going to be negative, but sometimes it's going to be positive. So you're essentially a gambler. Now, quite aside from the Skinner box, I'm going to harshly critique the gambling aspect because why would you go out of your way to have a bad experience? And here I don't necessarily mean that, let's say that you play a game and let's say that winning is fine and losing is fine. But in some games, winning might be just fine and losing just sucks. In fact, the ways you can lose could be pretty bad. You can get extremely punished, and even the game might punish you for leaving a game that you don't enjoy. So you don't want to get punished for leaving a punishment. And someone who's not used to this would think you're completely insane. But if you're the one who's playing the One-Arm Bandit, then it's like, this is amazing. Now, in the positive camp, we can easily put more games than ever. So, I think it would be very easy to argue that you can possibly pick a game that is positive. Yet, the gaming industry itself is kind of sketchy. And one aspect that I should mention regarding games, that it is very easy to have games be very rewarding. So, real life is not going to be necessarily that rewarding. So, even if you're doing something that are satisfying and rewarding, games can outdo it and surpass it because games don't have to abide reality. Like, how would you even get close? Like, let's say that you want to have some kind of fantasy about power, right? In a game, you can have it. But how you gotta do it in real life? Just learning math for like 1 hour is like, oh yeah, and try to desperately show you off, possibly, in the future. Yet I would argue that if you're already doing something, then you kind of get lost in it. So truly the dopamine spike is possibly the most noteworthy feature of even good games, and what we call good is certainly subjective. Again, my definition would be something that you're kind of happy that you played after like 1 year or something. Yet some games do very much ride this dopamine spike, which could make other activities other than gaming a little gray. To the point it can very much resemble a substance addiction, because at that point it makes everything else irrelevant and uninteresting. Possibly if you did those things, you could somewhat forget about it, but you're not necessarily drawn to it in the first place. In fact, I would argue that even after this time, it is not that easy to break away from it. Partly because it is just everywhere, right? You go on social media, on YouTube, and like you're just kind of exposed to it. And possibly your social circle is gaming too, and you see all the content creators are gaming. Yet, I would ask the question, does it make you happy? And do you have something to show for it? Now, you might say that you don't care, right? But suppose you had something, and you would prefer that. Then you do care. And it doesn't have to be a sacrifice. In fact, it very much could be, just to use a simple example that I already used before, and suppose that you find reading a book equally satisfying as playing a game. And then you would be possibly enriched by what you've read. Now, I'm not claiming that games can't possibly give you some thought-provoking stories or philosophical themes. In fact, I would not disregard enjoyment as part of the learning process, because then you're interested. That's pretty much the rule of every teacher, I suppose, would be that you first need to get the people interested. You cannot just take that for granted. Because if you go in front of an audience, you just say the right noises, and no one listens, no one cares, and you walk out and you collect your paycheck, what was the point? Just a paycheck? Let me suppose you didn't get that. Would you do it then? So I'm not disregarding here engagement, but still asking, was it satisfying? Was it rewarding? And not felt rewarding, but was it actually rewarding? That is a big difference in our culture, where arguably this is the culture of humanity, where there could be a lot of focus on people trying to win inside their own head, instead of trying to do something cool in reality. In the plus camps, I would say some games are positive, but which ones? And I'm using positive instead of good deliberately here. If I had to guess, I would say probably cooperative games with friends or non-infinite single-player games would probably rank high on that list, and likely competitive ones with strangers at the bottom, especially in a team setting. A big team setting. And this possibly would be my main point, that I might be open to playing positive games that are fine. I could just play them. It's going to be a satisfying experience just for relaxation. I'm not going to addict it, and I'm going to think positively of the experience, like even 1 year later, right? Yet the gaming industry is pretty dang sketchy. They're doing everything to get you to pay more, play more, and you have to understand that it's fundamentally different from everything else. Because let's suppose I want to sell you a hammer, right? I can just sell you things. I can promise that this hammer will save your life. But this hammer also will not program you according to my will. So I'm kind of critical of the Skinner box aspect of it. And even if the core game itself does not have that gameplay mechanic, although this is very debatable, they're probably going to add a monetization model that does. I know that their justification is going to be, we do it because it works. Because we make the most money with it. And that may be true, but I still don't like it. And I still was the kind of person who was not really vulnerable to this. I did see other people who suffered a bad beat, then went straight to the store. I was more the guy who paid nothing. Partly as a personal challenge, but partly because I did not really want to open that can of worms, which already shows a fundamental distrust toward these games. And I must point out that it wasn't always so. Keep in mind, in the past, Bethesda was mocked for releasing a horse armor, right? And that was not even 20 years ago. And now we are way past that. So, whatever bullshit the game has, I don't care. Especially as games transform from one-off satisfying experiences, you can certainly argue with me here, to mainly things that the player is supposed to play like all the time, and the game is deliberately trying to waste their time. The entire game effectively changed. So games weren't just things that you played sometimes, but you were a gamer who were probably playing way too many games. Way too much. Now, of course, this is subjective, but I would ask the question of, does it make you happy or you just do it a lot? Assuming you do it a lot. Because you can certainly have a positive experience and positive relationship with gaming. Which is probably best exercised as that you don't really care about the new games. They just come out, they're gonna come out broken anyway. So what's the point? Then after like 5 years, you can look at the reviews, whether people are actually happy or they're just hating their life and addicted to it. That's pretty much it. Yet even then it might still be an unfulfilling experience and you could be risking playing the wrong game. And another concerning part is that over time, in my opinion, the percentage of the sketchy games went up. And I do feel annoyed that it is just everywhere. I am not seeking it out, yet it happens to find me quite a bit. It doesn't matter if you go online and don't engage with anything gaming. It's just gonna find you constantly still. And while I do find it safer and probably the default choice to not play games, at least for me, because this could be a bit of a, I'm not sure if I could call it special, but it's only a bit of a different situation for me than someone who might just pick up games for the first time, is that I do have a history of playing those games that were addicting and breaking away from it. So to use an analogy, I was already the guy who was hooked to playing the one-armed bandit, right? Or at least a few ones that possibly appeal to me. Of course, if I looked at most games, I would be like, yeah, I'm not interested. But that pretty much doesn't matter, because there are so many games out there that if you go looking, you almost certainly find something, and you might just hit a landmine. And I suppose the alternative would be some kind of positive gaming, where you only play the games that are positive experiences and not too much. Because time spent playing in itself is pretty indicative of what most games are. Do you tend to play like half hour a day and then you leave entirely satisfied or something like that? Because in my experience, most games really angling for long sessions. Frequent and long sessions. And that's partly why I would be on the side of somewhat single player games. Because you can just play them and just save and load, I suppose. You're not really locked into a big match that could sometimes take hours. Or you're not incentivized to play like hours because of the game's economy. And keep in mind that this is essentially directly opposing the main aspect that many games are going for these days, which is addiction. Because what is a good game? There's no objective good. It's just possibly your preference, right? Especially things that you might find good that are just satiating, right? That is not good as a game. What you really want as a game is addiction, right? Spend as much time and spend as much money as possible. Now that is good. And possibly, it doesn't make you happy while playing, doesn't make you happy after playing, and you're certainly not going to be happy a year later. But generally, the experience is that it might give you dopamine spikes, so you are kind of getting the hits while you're playing, and then it's all emptiness. If you look at basically any popular game, but especially the most popular games, you might see that the players are miserable, and they are putting in a lot of time too. And some, and possibly even them, might argue that they're doing what they like. But do they? Or they're addicted. because I would make a distinction. So I suppose the main type of experience I would be promoting, assuming we are not going with the no gaming here, would be something like watching a movie. Like, I personally tend to watch movies once and not again, and that's it. And games don't really go for that these days. Yeah, we can certainly point out that there are a ton of games, and if you want to find a positive one, you almost certainly can. Yet, unless you're very careful, you're almost certainly gonna play something that is not like that. Is the particular, possibly new gamer in question gonna deep dive and like play like Green Fandango? I don't think so. Most likely they're gonna be playing the sketchy game, possibly initially with their friends, but also a ton without their friends too. And one can wonder, is the game good or do they just play it a lot? And not only that the gamers are miserable, and this is why I mainly put competitive games with strangers at the very bottom of the most likely positive gaming chart. Possibly my mind can be changed in some specific cases. And you can certainly argue that cooperative games tend to promote a different culture, but competitive ones, not so much. You could literally sign up to get harassed and play a terrible game, and you just hit it all the way. And even if you leave, you get punished. But that is possibly your only blessing. And later you realize that that game just saved your life. They did you a favor by being such pricks. And if I really think about my experience, I wouldn't say that the games that I like the most are the games that I played the most. But instead, I kind of play the games that made addiction their core feature, essentially. In fact, you might get to the point that, albeit there are more games than ever, your particular preference might not be that common. So suppose you like games like Planescape Torment. Well, that's great. That's certainly a game that I would like label as positive. But where would you go from there? You can't really go anywhere. You can expand it to other PC RPGs, I suppose, and you're probably gonna have a good time, and we can possibly still deem that positive gaming. Although it's worth mentioning that individually you might not be spending that much time with the games, but if you play a ton of games after each other, that still adds up. So irrespective of the game, if your playtime is just let's just go with intense, then that could be a questionable hobby. And if your retort to that would be that it's not a hobby, it's my life, then that is worth evaluating as well. Truly the most scary part, that even if the players are kind of happy with the game, they could be putting in insane amount of time, right? This could be not in even the thousands, but over 10,000 hours, right? And you might argue that this possibly can happen with almost anything. Yet games truly lend themselves to this behavior. Suppose you like water. You're not gonna drink like 100 liters of water a day because there's gonna be a satiation. In fact, if you go over your satiation, then it doesn't feel good. But that is not how games work, right? Generally speaking, more is better. Even if the game is not strictly trying to addict you to play more. Especially if you're a kid, they might be. If you're so inclined, you wake up in the morning, you start playing games all day, then you go to sleep. You still in some eating, and then you do the very same thing next day. Yeah, possibly one aspect that I should mention about games, that because of how spiky they could really preoccupy your thoughts, which can certainly contribute to the gray aspect you might be feeling toward other activities, but it doesn't entirely cover it. Because instead of having other desires, other ideas, you just think about games. So not only other things might give you a lesser hit, but also games are the only thing you think about. And everything else is just annoyance. Gets in the way of thinking about the game and playing the game. And even when you're doing other things, you could be just thinking about the game as well. And I would argue in this case, it's really hard to argue that this is positive. So in this case, you cannot be in the moment. You're either gaming and you're kind of happy with that, or you're thinking about gaming and you're kind of miserable with the thing you're doing because like, oh my God, this is not gaming. So you could be constantly haunted by gaming and, oh my God, just give me peace. To play a little bit the other side, I'm gonna put engaging as a plus to games. But you gotta keep in mind that there are no games in nature. So only games in your mind. So whatever you can make a game. And in fact, anything is satisfying because you can find doing it kind of meaningful. What it is kind of meaningful. So you can read a book, but if it was just like random letters, you would not care. The book is meaningful because it has words in order that capture your interest. This video possibly is engaging because I'm making the right noises with my mouth. That's it. So as long as the game is positive, you can argue that adding an engaging element to something that is possibly positive for your life is a plus. But while I would argue that gamification for good is useful and can be healthy, well, partly it can be used for other reasons as well. But the main reason is that you still need to gamify things yourself. So possibly if you're engaging in games too much, then you are not finding or making the games out there. Making would be the key point here. So essentially you can argue that you can make everything a game, right? Of course, within reason. But essentially it would be just silly to not make an activity as satisfying, as engaging, and as rewarding as possible, especially if it actually confers increased results. Because if you have to read a book, then your best strategy not would be just trying to grind it, but try to get interested in it first, right? And then you're going to pay attention. So while I would argue that the engaging element, assuming the game is possibly positive, and again, that can be very subjective, it's good, but you still need to learn gamification and possibly appreciate real life games. So that would be the difference between someone who goes to the beach and like, what is this? This just sucks. And another guy who just already making a sandcastle. While the cranky guy is possibly thinking about pulling out their phone and playing a phone game, right? Now, of course, in this game, the game could be arbitrary, and arguably it always is, but sometimes it is an activity that you would do anyway. And let's even suppose something like art, right? It could be entirely meaningless. In fact, some might not enjoy art, although generally an enjoyed activity, I suppose. So perhaps a better example could be like, I don't know, like coding or writing or whatever. The thing is, like these activities are not necessarily enjoyed by all. But those who enjoy it can, even if we don't call it gaming, they find the activity satisfying. So one negative would be that you might not learn gamification, although we can argue either way because you might be more familiar with it, but again, you're not actively making games. But one aspect that we must consider, that games that are made for you are fundamentally passive. You're not creating anything, you are a consumer. And I don't just mean not having anything to show for it. And certainly some games have more of a room for creativity in them. But even that is restricted and limited compared to just doing whatever you want. So whether positive or negative, the third category would be, which I suppose in this case would not be limited by the constraints of games, but you are a creator. You make the games, and you change them, and you make the rules. And that is possibly would be my ongoing annoyance with many games, and that is partly why I really enjoyed the modding scene, is that if you kind of like the game, but you would want to change things in it, you can't, right? And this is still pretty much true if you want to make bigger changes, because the mods are kind of like, we change a few small things, but that's pretty much it. But especially like online games, you're out of luck. If they make changes you don't like, well, I guess you can quit. Or fundamentally, there are just many things that you don't like. You just have to take it. So at that point, I might even give the point to games that don't change that much. So they're kind of sticking to their original niche instead of just making changes all the time in an effort to excite the audience, because like maybe keeping things stale is boring, possibly, but just shoveling things in is almost certainly gonna piss off a lot of people. So you're possibly gonna go from bored to annoyed. So if you do things, then you actually have control. In games, you kind of given the illusion of control and the illusion of reward and the illusion of choice, the illusion of meaning. I can't really say that you possibly like this, right? But it is important to point out that this is rewarding. And games just kind of feel rewarding. And if you really taste the difference, then games could feel kind of hollow. And of course, you also have to consider that many games are kind of like the one-arm bandits, so they're like, why would I play that? It's just stupid. So you might ask yourself, why would I spend like many hours of my life just to, after, shut down the monitor and feel utterly hollow? Yet, let's be fair here, I still engage in quite a lot of consumption, and my main concern toward games would be how addicting they are. And oftentimes, the experience you're getting is not even good. And that is on purpose, because they kind of want you addicted. Because I'm not sure if you're familiar, but the best way to addict people is not by just giving them constant positive reinforcement, but by giving them variadic positive and negative reinforcement. And this way, they're gonna stick with the activity the longest. Possibly their entire lives. Because let's suppose you had a button that always gave you candy, and you suppose you like candy, and you kept eating the candy, kept pressing the button, and it did not give you candy anymore, right? It was like you would just conclude like, okay, that's it. So only positive reinforcement every time is easy to break. But if you had a button that gave you candy on like every 5th click, then you might just click it a lot. And even if you got unlucky for like 25 times in a row, you might still keep clicking it. That is how humans are wired, and that is what games try to exploit. To not make good games, but games that make the most money. And you might say, sure, then I'm just gonna play the good games, or whatever they are, but you will be still pretty dang close to a sketchy industry that is getting as sketchy as possible. Because they are looking to maximize profit, not consumer satisfaction. Especially if wholesome positivity is gonna hurt the bottom line. Another part of my reason would be that I pretty much played the games that I kind of wanted to. And no doubt, if I went looking, I probably would find games that I would be interested in. I'm not really interested in figuring that out, though. But still, my main point would be that, despite that there are more games than ever, there seem to be less games that I'm interested in. Or at least was my main interest. So you might claim that I'm arrogant for making this point, but I don't care. And I think it's generally true that games as a whole kind of got dumber, or you can say more accessible. Because let's say that around 2000, games were mostly for nerds with computers. And it took time for games to be cool and mainstream. But this also meant that even console games kind of got grouped up with PC games, and I guess there are some games on mobile. I don't know. I don't play any of them, but I imagine that they're not good. But I suppose I might be more drawn to like deep philosophical stories, if we can have something like that. Like PC RPGs might touch on that, but you generally just have some kind of a chore gameplay. It kind of varies. And I'm not making the claim that there aren't possibly games like that out there. I'm just saying that there aren't that many. So most likely, if you play them, you're not going to be a gamer. You're just going to be some guy who possibly plays like 2 games a year, right? Maybe 1. And generally, there seems to be a disinterest in just making smart games. I don't know if they would sell. Truly, I don't know. But I would like to see them, right? Even though this video is kind of like why I could quit games, but I would like to see still the gaming industry as more positive, and I suppose less dumb. By the way, just for clarification, I don't mean positive in a sense of like feel good stories, although it possibly would be more preferred to some kind of a ragey online multiplayer, but simply experiences you're kind of happy to have. And I would be pretty much open to see darker themes, which are again tend to be not seriously explored in games, even if you have the option. Even in my beloved RPGs, PC RPGs, it's usually not a very satisfying one. So essentially, you would have the option between playing a classic hero guy versus some kind of stupid dick who's not even acting out of self-interest, but they just want to be a dick. That's it. So games that actually allowed some freedom, creative freedom to the player to play as they like, told better evil stories in a way than games that actually put in evil dialogue options, if we call it evil. And the industry is not only sketchy, but it takes a big responsibility. Why I would not consider myself at all excited to hear about new games. Because the industry is kind of big. Everyone kind of plays it safe. You're not going to tell a story that possibly is going to be too smart or too dark. So pretty much you get a copy-paste of a previous game. And the way the games play could make newer games kind of pointless too. Because like, wow, look at this. We released another shooter guy story and that's it. Like, okay, what's the point in this? It's literally pointless. They can release like 20 more like it and same thing. It's literally pointless. I can't even tell them apart. And outside of indie games, no one is really trying new things. It's kind of good to see that the indie genre is healthier, I suppose. Because before the indie revolution, I truly had no hope for the gaming industry. And now we shall see. One aspect that might help the gaming industry is that AI might make it cheaper to make games, so we're gonna see more niche games, but also more trash. To the point where you might only see the big established players getting attention. Because let's say that even right now, you write a book. No one is gonna find that book, right? You need to get eyeballs on that book, but how are you gonna get eyeballs? So you can use AI to write your book, but it doesn't matter because no one will read that. And that could be the future of games too. That games are just spammed out, but no one cares. No one has time to find your stuff. So what really matters is the potential profit the game might make and marketing. And while it can open up some avenues to make new original games, very original ones, the unfortunate reality that those who make such games will almost certainly gonna find out that people most likely won't care. People just play the same games all the time, even if it makes them miserable. So, comical example could be that some moviegoer who's complaining about the superhero movies, but also only watching the superhero movies because, like, that's what they see advertised. Like, yeah. But it is also their preference. So they might say they don't like it, but they sure eat it a lot. And that is the only thing what companies care about. And that is, unfortunately, the only thing even individuals should care about. If you're trying to make something for an audience. And I would really draw into question the philosophy of game making as well. Because I would argue most games, even the ones that I kind of liked, even unintentionally, waste your time. It would be such a rarity to see a game that goes out of their way to not waste your time. So perhaps one gameplay element that you might enjoy, that I do not enjoy, would be crafting. And just gathering stuff and waiting for it to craft and possibly other related activities. Now, of course, in a colony manager game or some kind of manager game, this could be fine. This could be the gameplay. and especially in a strategy game. But in like some kind of an RPG or whatever, this just sucks, especially if you're forced into it. Like, oh, we added it, and such a plus. And yeah, this is actually a good angle to consider, that games can rarely be just one genre these days. Everything must be for everyone. So they're kind of hoping that we're gonna get everyone in here. It's gonna be a little bit of FPS, and a little bit of RPG, and a little bit of survival game, and a little bit of just everything, right? Just put everything in there, and the game fucking sucks, right? Instead of making one good game, you made, I don't know, with some kind of amalgam of a crappy one. So many games in there. And in some cases it's optional, but there's usually like a wink wink, so you like optional, but you get screwed. But irrespective of everything, instead of making one good game for an audience, they don't care about that. They just want to make an addicting game for everyone. That's pretty much the philosophy right there. It's gotta be bland too, and you've played it before. Exactly like it. And then pretty much everyone is doing it. So it's okay. Maybe some doing it a little bit less, others are doing it a little bit more. It doesn't matter. In fact, even RPG games changed quite a bit over the years. And initially they were more hardcore. They didn't really care about giving you nonsense tasks. It was a role-playing adventure with possibly meaningful fighting. But that wasn't really the center stage. And it really does not matter that much of what kind of fighting the game has. I suppose we can mention action role-playing games where action takes center stage, but that's a totally valid preference, I suppose. But my main critique would be just the quests and the role-playing aspect of it. So an action RPG would be just an action game. You don't really have anything to go on. You just get stuff, right? Again, you might argue that is fine there, but even other RPGs are kind of poisoned. You're gonna get the slay 10 wolves or something. And that's not like a silly MMO thing, but that's kind of the way the RPGs went. And again, there are exceptions, but if you picked up a RPG from current days, it is far more likely to reflect that. So you might see striving to be an addicting game for everyone, and it's bland too. And possibly ever more games fall into the category of graphics over substance. Which is probably doubly telling, because if your game is that good, why would you want to possibly limit the number of customers? Why care about it? Just have a game that runs totally fine on most older hardware and just make the game good. But of course that is not what you see oftentimes, but the game needs to look very, very good. Now this certainly could help with the marketing to tempt a certain kind of audience. But I can't help but feel that if they focused on the look so much, they probably cut corners somewhere else. So in most cases, it's not really a case of you can have everything, but what have you focused on? But again, this pretty much doesn't matter as long as you are willing to be extremely selective and look for the exact games you like, which you should make sure that are kind of positive. And I suppose that would already contain that you're not really getting addicted to them. But saying that you should mostly create, somewhat consume, but make sure it's positive is a little bit too simple. And we are putting the responsibility a bit too much on the player. And so you would kind of want the responsibility. You don't want to be a victim of the industry. Still one hell of a risk. But do you want to take it needlessly? And if you look at the top games, and of course, this is all subjective, but we can see that the games that tend to get played the most also tend to get the saltiest reviews. What we are not gonna go over here, because it just gonna take too long, and they don't particularly respect your time. And sure, we can argue that this is all fine, you just gotta make an informed choice initially, and start playing now, you can quit anytime. And any game that is not greatly replayable tend to not make it to the top of the leaderboard, or tend to be anywhere on the leaderboard really. And even having 3-digit worth of players after some time would be kind of impressive. We only really see games here that are highly replayable and presumably highly addictive. And you might make the argument that it is all fine. It is all up to you and you can manage it. And that might be entirely true. But I'm just saying that possibly others can't. And possibly even you, at least over time, had an updated version of what is acceptable amount of gaming and what is acceptable amount of acceptable behavior from companies. Because once business practices that were considered ridicule-worthy are now common. So that is pretty much it. I'm not hating on gaming strictly. I am more hating on the race to the bottom that we possibly see. And that any game that can really aspires to be a life replacement, be addicting as possible, try to take as much time and money from you as possible, and that is what we call good. Or that is what is a good game. Because good is essentially, when it comes to companies, is essentially just evaluated as well, not even popularity, just money, right? Even the game that you play the most, would you call the best game or I suppose that would be the most appropriate way to call it, because you might occasionally play games that take 30 hours to finish. But then, if you're a gamer, then you really can't invest solely your time in those. Those games do exist, but possibly those quality experiences, if they're quality, they're not gonna be super commonplace. Or possibly you don't even go after them as much as you might even claim that you like them. So, but even if you prefer them, you might still not play them. In a way, you are the customer who's eating the equivalent of fast food, or you're the one who's scrolling your phone for whatever, right? So yeah, even within the games, you might find a better game. Certainly you can do something else too. But why would you do that when you have that, one or a few games that you play all the time that you don't even like that much, but you do play it? And if you want to be creative, will a game do that? Will a game allow you to be as creative as possible? Or you can just do your thing. That's almost certainly going to be superior. Suppose you want a good story. I'm not even suggesting AI here, but do games have the best story? Arguably some possibly do. But generally they can be a little watered down. Now, mainly, if you really want just the story, almost certainly you will be better off going after a book that sells itself just with the story. And the game would be more possibly, if you experience it as such, could be diluted with just chores. Which is essentially what gameplay is. Just chores that the game wants you to like. Yet even if you like some of it, you might not like all of it. Yet even if you looked at a game that's like 50 hours or 100 hours, you can ask yourself, is the length justified? Because in my experience, which could be vast, almost certainly you can just drop it to third or at least half. Oftentimes a lot more. And it is just padded with a bunch of busy work. And some might argue that it's great gameplay, but I'm not so sure. Or at least it should not be a mandatory, I suppose, to experience the padding. Yet oftentimes, you don't have much of a choice. One thing that is a bit niche, but kind of annoys me, is that I, generally speaking, don't much like voice acting. When I listen to things, I tend to speed it up. And in games, there is no such option, right? That you might argue that is fine, and this is my peculiarity. But even irrespective of that, I would be personally preferring games where you read instead of hearing some amateur voice actor, possibly even better, but just trying their best, but it takes forever. So not only I can read the text faster, but also I might just scan it and just take out the relevant part. But if you hear a fucking monologue, it's gonna be like, 1 hour long. It's like, I don't care. I certainly could care, but the game would need to earn that. And games tend to be full of this random bullshit that just wastes your time, And of course, I picked kind of a harder example here, but still the explanation would be that this is gameplay. And technically that is true. But also this is partly the problem with games, that part of the games are kind of meant to be infinite, right? You just play them all the time, and they're definitely not better for it. And the other type of games are kind of expected to be long, right? Books kind of suffer from this problem too, that you don't tend to see books that are less than 300 pages. That means that if the author has like 5-page worth of stuff, well, they should not make a book, right? Well, you would be thinking that, but they're gonna make a book anyway, and they might make it like 400 pages. And oh boy, it feels like it. And games could fall into the same category. So it probably had a story that you can repeat in a minute, but it was a 50-hour plus game. And of course, anyone can argue that they like it. And you might say, I love that. But if you like that, then I might also interest you in a beer served in a barrel of water too. It is right up your alley. And while you're drinking it, you will be doing some chores that we'll be calling a game. So that's pretty much it. There are definitely good games out there. I know because I've played them. And there's gotta be definitely more, but I'm just not that interested in fighting them. And overall, find the gaming industry more trouble than it's worth. Even if someone wanted to do a lot of gaming, it would probably make more sense to actually find some positive games and then kind of hold on to them like dear life. Although even in this case, it's hard to tell if they are good or you're just addicted. So that's it.